people from within your field, but you'll need to have a statistician, trial managers, data coordinator, trial methodologists, and in the UK and in certain countries, you also have the support of clinical trials units. So you may want to sign up with one of them to support your study. But then the bits that I think I didn't know about when I started with the trial are you need input from your finance team to support you with the funding aspects, legal team, because if you have multiple sites, you have to have contracts with all of the sites, and then you have to have someone sponsor oversight just in case there are any issues with the patients within the trial. And then oversight committees, you have to have a trial steering committee who's an independent committee having oversight of your trial, a data monitoring committee who's looking at the data and will feed and report back to the trial steering committee. And then throughout the trial, you want to have patient and public involvement at all stages. And then lastly, thinking about costing and funding. Clinical trials, unfortunately, cost a huge amount of money. So you have to get finance to support your staff. You need recruiting costs and time for your co-investigators and your research staff. You need costs not only to get the drug, but to have it packaged, to have it distributed. You need to think about your database, and that costs quite a large chunk of your money. Costs of approvals and other registrations. In the UK, it's the MHRA, in the States, the FDA, for example. And then you've got your ethics and R&D approvals and your contracts, promotional materials, potentially travel for your staff to go to the different sites, the costs of the oversight committee. These are less now that we can use Zoom and Teams. You may want to build in costs for publishing your results as well. And in the UK and then certainly other parts of Europe, you have indirect costs which go to your institution, your university. So all of this builds up to a lot of money that you need to run your trial. The other thing is you need to build in time. So this is how long it took us to get the funding for the grant. And actually, we didn't have any knockbacks. So you can see we started thinking about the grant in June 2013, submitted an outline, full application, board review, and it wasn't until January 2015 that we were able to start thinking about the trial and seeking ethical approval. And then you need to think about the trial itself. You might want to draw out a Gantt chart like this, looking at each month about how long each step of the trial will take. You know, your recruitment period needs to be a feasible period of time to allow you to recruit the patients, your sample size, and then you need to think about the follow-up time afterwards for the patients, and then time for your analysis. And then when you're setting up your trial, you'll need to develop your protocol, all your patient-facing materials, involve your PPI, start your approvals. You need to set up all of your sites, so your team will need to either visit or have remote site initiation visits. Really important, make sure you register your trial before you start. We had 39 sites across the UK for GAP2, so as you can imagine, that was quite a big undertaking. You might want to stagger how you open these sites, and you need to take that into account when you're predicting how long it's going to take you to recruit your patients. And then once you're open and you start recruitment, you need to build in your oversight meetings. You'll have to report back to your funder and your sponsor. You need to publish and sign off and close your statistical analysis plan. Ideally publish your protocol, and as your data comes in, start checking and cleaning your data so that you're ready for analysis. And you need to be prepared for challenges, lack of equipoise amongst the patients, or as we found in many of our endometriosis trials, amongst the clinicians. So they maybe think they know the answer to the study or don't agree with the trial, so that can be challenging. You might find that your inclusion criteria are too tight and you don't have enough patients or less patients than you thought. You need to continually think about making sure that your population that you're recruiting from is a diverse population. And then you may have unexpected challenges, as we had in GAP2. So this was our original plans, or how quickly we thought we would recruit the patients. This is the consent time, so just ignore that line, but the blue line is actually how long it took us to recruit our patients. We ran out of money for the trial at this point and had to apply for more funding, and then no sooner did we got the funding, then we had this big snowstorm in the UK, which actually closed the factory that was making the drug and the placebo. So again, an unexpected knockback. And then, of course, more recently, trials have been impacted by COVID, and there's still an ongoing impact on clinical trials and our ability to deliver clinical trials due to COVID, at least in the UK. And then in the final stages, you'll be cleaning your data, closing your sites, locking your data for the statisticians to look at, analysing it, and then you need to think about making that data widely available so that everybody can access and look at your results. And I said, think about dissemination. Now, clearly, these are all standard things that you need to do with any research that I've listed here, but I think what's important with a trial is thinking about how you're going to present it to the public and the patients. So, for example, with GAP2, we prepared a video which we put onto YouTube, onto social media, which explained the results of the trial in lay terms, essentially. And I think that's really important, particularly if patients are giving up their time. They think it's an important question. They want to hear about the results. And the other thing is just to think about how, this is a huge team effort, how you're going to decide who's going to write your paper, do the analysis. So form a writing group, decide authorship early, consider disclosures, and use input from your PPI group. So just a few take-home messages. I think it's really important, because trials take a long time, that you decide carefully what your research question is going to be, what your hypothesis is going to be, and make sure it's exciting and interesting for you. As I say, involve a trials unit, an experienced statistician, take advice continually from other people who've run trials, double the estimate of the time you think it's going to take. It always, unfortunately, takes longer. And then make sure you have people that are going to run the trial for you from day to day. It's impossible to do that as a chief investigator. And then just enjoy it. It is a fun experience because it is a team experience. And I certainly love doing clinical trials. So just to finish there, I think Engin showed this slide. Hope all of you are going to come to the World Congress in Sydney next year. And as I said, this is a big team effort. Some photographs of our team in Edinburgh, all our collaborators and our funders. So I'm very grateful to all of them who've contributed not only to this trial that I've shown you here as an example, but lots of the other studies that we do within this field. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew, for this great overview. Any questions? We have time for one question, I would think. Engin, please.
Good morning. Thank you, Andrew. And in this study, you have 39 centers, right? 39. It is a huge number. In this country, in my country, it is difficult to establish multi-center study because of the collaboration. How did you solve the problem? What is the clues to do multi-center study, especially if the center of more than 10 and something like that?
So it's a really good question. So we're lucky in the UK in that there's a research network which does support centres and hospitals who want to take part in trials. So there's some funding that's already been put into that. But I think the main thing is building relationships with these centres. So we're now in a fortunate position, having run one trial, is that we have established relationships with principal investigators in different centres. So it's about that contact. In order to identify sites, we go to, Lucy and I, for example, go to conferences and have a stand at the conference about the trial, so trying to encourage people to take part. We'll go through societies, send out emails asking people to take part. But it is difficult, and there'll be some people who just don't want to be part of it, or There's some sites who maybe do want to be part of it, but don't have the support there to be able to run it. But I think it's about building those relationships, and then once you've got them, then the next trial becomes easier after that.
Thank you, Andrew.
Now we are going on with the second speaker. I'm inviting Katie Vincent to the stage. She is from Oxford University, and she is research group leader of the Oxford Pain in Women and chair of the International Association for the Study of the Pain on Abdominal and Pelvic Pain. Her research focus on chronic pelvic pain and endometriosis. Stage is yours.
Thank you very much. And Andrew, you set up this very nicely for me to be able to follow on from what you said to talk about how we should select patient report outcome measures for clinical trials. Those are my disclosures. So I'm going to talk briefly about what patient report outcome measures really are and why we need them, and then think about whether the endometriosis studies that have been done in the past use pain-relevant PROMs appropriately, and then think about what recommendations we should be following when we design clinical studies in endometriosis and adenomyosis. So what are PROMs and why do we need them? Well, PROMs are patient-reported outcome measures. So they're usually questionnaires and they are completed by the patient themselves. So they're different from clinician assessments, and they directly assess things that are of value or importance to patients. Core outcome sets, abbreviated to COSs, are a set of PROMs and that they are agreed on by consensus. And it's important when we think about the core outcome sets that we use for clinical trials that we think about two separate things within them. So we think about domains, which are the areas that we're capturing. So pain, for example, is a domain, quality of life is a domain. And then we also need to define specific tools that we use to capture those domains. And that can be things like a numerical rating scale, that's a tool. The EHP 30, the quality of life measure, that's a tool. So we need to make sure we remember the difference between those two things. So how do we develop PROMs? Well, there are very clear pathways for how you would develop a new patient report outcome measure, which obviously first of all involves working out whether you really do need to do another one or whether something is already in existence that can be used or adapted. But it's also really important that we have patient involvement in developing PROMs. It's not just about what we think is important to assess. And development of a new PROM is really a multi-stage process, starting from working out what we think might be important to then working out whether actually what we've designed assesses that appropriately and is sensitive to change. And as an example, the EHP 30 was a 3-stage process and used over 1,000 women in the development of that tool. And how do we develop a core outcome set? Well, it's really important that a core outcome set is developed with involvement of all the relevant stakeholders. And you'll see as I talk later on how we can end up, if we're not careful, making a core outcome set that a small group of people really agree on, but that then doesn't reflect wider practice within the field. So we need to involve patients in our core outcome set, but we also need to involve clinicians, but policymakers as well, because if we're using these as the basis of our future clinical trials, then the people that determine the policies are also going to need to agree with them. And we're lucky now that the Comet Initiative based in Liverpool has really good guidance on how you should develop a core outcome set. And so as long as you follow their suggestions, then you're developing something that should meet with approval. And we tend to use a Delphi process, which is a sort of formalized way of reaching consensus, where you start by making a very long list of possible options, and then you repeatedly vote on whether you think each of those options should be included in your core outcome set. And you have to repeat that voting again and again until consensus is made, and you define your criteria for consensus before you start voting. So it can be a very long process, and sometimes you can just get stuck in a loop where people just keep on going backwards and forwards and no agreement is reached. And first of all, you consent on the domains, so you don't even begin to think about what tools you use for assessment until you've agreed what domains are important. And then after that, you should consent on specific tools. But some of the core outcome sets tend to leave it just a little bit more open and just say, well, as long as you are assessing pain, as long as you are assessing quality of life, then we've covered it. So why do we need to use these in our future clinical trials? Well, I think Andrew's already mentioned, it's really important that we measure something meaningful to patients. There's no point in us asking about pain if actually the patients care much more about quality of life, for example. But it's also really important that we capture the full patient experience. And again, the clinician assessment may not reflect all the things that the patient thinks is important. And many trials nowadays use patient report outcome measures as our primary outcome. But there are other areas, for example, you might want to do a blood pressure trial. You'd want to absolutely measure the blood pressure and the change in blood pressure, but you would then want to use PROMs as an adjunct to that to allow you to capture a fuller experience. But I think it's also really important that as we move forwards, we're wanting to compare data from lots of different trials to combine it together to be able to do meta-analyses. And if all the measures that we've used for our trials are different between different studies, then it's absolutely impossible to combine them. So everybody agreeing together means that we can then in the future go forwards to do meta-analyses and have a really robust evidence base for our clinical practice. So I'm going to focus now on pain because the pain domains of endometriosis studies have been much more rigorously assessed with PROMs, whereas fertility studies have tended to be assessed with more biological measures. So I'm just going to look at the work that's been done looking at whether endometriosis trials in the past have used pain-relevant PROMs appropriately. So Andrew already mentioned IMPACT. So IMPACT is a group in the US who are now called ACTION because they've expanded their area of interest. And they've been working really since the early 2000s to develop really, really strong, clear recommendations for how chronic pain trials should be run. And the first work they did was to define their core outcome sets of domains. More recently, they've done lots of work on looking at whether we can use biomarkers as part of clinical trials and how we can combine multiple primary outcomes, for example. But so the initial core outcome set for chronic pain, which has been around, as I say, for sort of 20 years now, was very clear that we need to assess more than just chronic pain itself. So we need to think about what are the impacts of the pain? So how well does our patient population function physically? How do they function emotionally? What symptoms and adverse effects are they getting from the treatments we recommend? How do they rate the global improvement? And then sort of more general data on that we would need for any kind of clinical trial about the participants and their general demographics, for example. And they then went on to be very clear about what tools we should use to assess these domains. So, for example, recommending that we should always use a 0 to 10, so an 11-point numerical rating scale for pain intensity, describing some possible measures we could use for emotional functioning, physical functioning, for example. So we had a meeting to see whether we could actually apply these to endometriosis. And this was a meeting that was sponsored by the NIH, and we reported on it in 2010, trying to see, could we adapt IMPACT for endometriosis? Now, we fully put my hand up and say this would not meet the COMET recommendations now, but those did not exist in 2010. So this was a preparatory meeting, and we sent out a lot of information beforehand, but all the decisions were just made in a single-day consensus meeting. And we felt that we could very much adapt the recommendations, but there were two very clear specific challenges that were relevant to endometriosis-associated pain. And the first thing is that most of our patients have more than one type of pain. So it's not the same as, say, chronic low back pain. Actually, our patients have dysmenorrhea, dyschezia, non-cyclical pain, dyspareunia. How do we account for that? We can't have 5 primary outcome measures. And also, how do we account for changes in bleeding pattern or sexual activity? So I have real worries that sometimes when I hear clinical trials presented and people say that we had a really high improvement in their overall pain scores, actually what was being measured was dysmenorrhea, and the treatment that was being given induced amenorrhea in a large proportion of the patient group. So actually, if they had had dysmenorrhea of 9 out of 10 and they're not having periods at all, obviously their cyclical pain has gone down to 0, but actually does that really reflect an outcome of interest unless we are specifically interested in dysmenorrhea. And on the other hand, we do see that patients' dyspareunia scores will often get worse after they start being treated, because actually they're feeling so much better, their sexual activity rates actually go up, and then they find that they're starting to still experience pain from it. So I think we just need to be mindful of that when we think about how we deliver these outcomes. So some work done as part of the IMI Pain Care project has looked at whether the domains and problems that were assessed in pain trials in endometriosis have been relevant to the impact recommendations. So this was a really large systematic review that in the end included 191 studies. And what we can see here is whether the domains recommended by impact were included in these trials. And you can see the blue bars are the studies that were defined as being high quality studies, and the red bars were the low quality studies. And what you can see is, probably unsurprisingly, 100% of the trials used some form of measure to assess for pain, but then the other domains were much less well assessed, and the one that was then next well assessed was side effects and adverse events. So we really aren't thinking about pain as a broader, multidimensional experience that widely impacts patients' lives. And as you saw from the impact recommendations, you need to collect multiple of these. But when we looked at whether the studies published previously had thought about multiple domains, actually that really wasn't the case. Most studies used only one or at most two measures, and the two commonest ones were pain plus or minus adverse events. And capturing things like emotional functioning was done really poorly. So you can see that we're already not really understanding the full experience of pain. But I guess if 100% of the trials looked at pain, we should at least then be able to combine these outcomes to see whether there was benefit. But unfortunately, that's also not true, because the assessment of pain was so variable. So you can see that the NRS, which is the impact recommendation for how we should assess pain, was only used in 7% of trials. Most trials used a visual analog scale, which has a lot of issues relating to its reproducibility, particularly in the days of paper-completed forms. But then the majority of the other trials used a wide variety of other measures, and we have no way of actually combining these into a meta-analysis. So what recommendations should we be following when we design our clinical trials? And unfortunately, there's an awful lot. You could start by using the ones that we originally recommended, or you could use the ones that have been formalized with a much more of a COMET-approved process. Or you could think about some of the newer ones that relate to perioperative pain with a specific focus on endometriosis surgery. Or you could think about specific treatments for adenomyosis. Or you could say, actually, I care about infertility. And I think it's really important when we think about what we're going to do, how we choose which of these recommended core outcome sets we follow. So what are the challenges with choosing a core outcome set? Well, I think the most important thing, first of all, is to decide what is the focus of your trial. Is it pain or is it fertility? And then decide, should you choose an overarching core outcome set that is recommended from the pain world or recommended from the fertility world? Or should you choose something that's relevant for your disease process? Or should you choose something that's relevant for your procedure? And I think we run the risk of getting stuck needing multiple of these if we're not careful. We should also think about whether all our participants actually have the disease, because some of these core outcome sets are really only relevant for patients with that disease. So that's particularly important, for example, in the context of chronic pelvic pain. If you were going to do a chronic pelvic pain trial, you actually can't use an endometriosis core outcome set, because we know that, for example, the EHP 30 is only validated for patients who have endometriosis, not for those who have pelvic pain. And then could you think about combining core outcome sets? So could you use an endometriosis one, a pain one, and a fertility one, or actually would you massively overburden your patients? We know that we're going to want them to complete these at multiple time points, at entry and at the end, but probably once or twice in the middle as well. And if it's going to take over an hour to complete all of these questionnaire sets, are your participants really going to be prepared to do that? Or are they going to do it properly, even if they do it, or will they have lost interest by the end of the pack? And it's also really important to think, particularly if you're doing multinational trials, are all the problems that you want to use available and validated in the languages that you require? And one very useful resource is the PROMISE resource from NIH, and that is a set of patient-reported outcome measures that cover a really wide range of different variables, but all of them have been validated and they're freely available, but they're also available in multiple translations into different languages. And if you pay, they will do a formal translation into a language that doesn't exist already as well. So our current recommendations for the general endometriosis core outcome set were published in 2020, and I think that they are insufficient to assess pain. So I would say that if you wanted to do a pain trial in endometriosis, you'd really have to think about something a bit broader as well. They also include some measures which I think might be considered irrelevant or upsetting to some participants. So we would need to be careful how we thought about wording all of these within some of our sets. We know that surgical trials might need additional measures over above medical trials, and we know that we need to capture acute complications of surgery, but we also really need to consider the time course of recovery, because that may be very variable for different individuals, and therefore just having fixed time points that we collect our outcome measures without thinking about the time course of recovery may give us false information. And as I mentioned yesterday, there's always this risk of developing a new post-surgical pain, and so we need to make sure we have measures that appropriately capture that. So Prompt, as part of IMI Pain Care, had done a large Delphi project looking at 4 different surgical procedures. So they included laparoscopy for endometriosis, but they also did knee surgery, sternostomy, and breast surgery. And they looked at whether they could make overarching recommendations for core outcome sets for perioperative pain, or whether they would need to be specific to these 4 separate conditions. And in fact, they had an overarching core outcome set, because actually, even when we voted on the separate things, in the end, the top measures were the same. And so anyone doing an acute surgical trial might want to think about using their recommendations. And they do fit generally with the standard pain measures, apart from the fact that they think it's really important to capture pain self-efficacy, so your ability to manage your own pain, and also to capture pain intensity at rest. And I think this is an area where things like wearables will become really important in the future, because we'll be able to relate measures of actual activity and sleep, for example, to patients' questionnaire report outcomes. So I think this is somewhere that will really expand over the coming years. There's also been recently a international agreement jointly between the NIH and the EU about thinking again about, can we standardize the really key core outcome sets, being aware that everybody has different ones. So rheumatology have their OMERACT set, we have our own endometriosis ones, other areas have theirs. And so this was aiming to just set a really minimum set of core outcome sets that could be added onto anything that was already existing disease specific. And they thought about pain slightly differently. So they thought about acute pain, the transition from acute to chronic pain, but also recurrent and episodic pain, which I think is of relevance to lots of our patients with cyclical pain, for example. And you can see that they recommend, in the main box, they recommend the absolute minimum core outcome set. And then on the side, they also recommend some additional sets that could be considered if you had the capacity. And I think you can see all the way through the key things, again, are pain intensity, but also pain interference. So how much does your pain impact on your life? So in conclusion, it's really important that we use a set of standardized PROMs or a core outcome set in clinical trials, but it's complicated to decide which core outcome sets we should be using, and I think that needs to be really carefully thought about. And I think if your core outcome set that is available doesn't capture everything that feels important to you or everything that feels important to the patients you talk to as you design the trial, then there are plenty of additional tools you could add into that set. And I think it's going to be really important in the future as we design our core outcome set that we don't work in silos, so that the people who design an endometriosis core outcome set need to also talk to those who work in pain and those who work in fertility, for example, to make sure that the core outcome sets cover all of those areas. And so this is just to acknowledge the people that I work with, but also particularly Daniela, who is the PhD student who did most of that systematic review in prompt under the guidance of Esther Pazat-Cizan. Thank you.
Thank you for your detailed presentation. We can have 1 or 2 questions. Yes.
Thank you, Katie Vincent. 2 questions. I believe one of the major dilemma for to do clinical trials in pain, because it's the subjective, not the objective one. That's very, very important. How do you deal with this one? Which measures, which scale using the most convenient for us? I mean, for the not for the trial, for the simple clinical trial. And the second one, what is the effect of the placebo on the pain? What percentage? I believe it's important to discuss which treatment is effective is not. Thank you.
So in terms of which outcome measures to use, I would absolutely recommend that we follow the impact guidance for assessing pain, and the tools that they recommend for assessing pain intensity is a 0 to 10 numerical rating scale. And that's easy to use either electronically or on paper. I just think that it's really important that we assess the relevant pain so that we have separate scales for dysmenorrhea, separate scale for non-cyclical pain, rather than having a summed score at the end, because actually that doesn't allow you to unpick the nuance of what might have happened to changes in function, for example. In terms of placebo, you're absolutely right. Placebo effect is at least 20% in any study that is used. I mean, I think Andrew mentioned using a mechanistic study embedded within any form of clinical trial, and I think that's particularly important when we think about placebo effects in terms of drugs, because what we know is that the placebo effect for pain engages a whole load of mechanisms within the brain that enhance descending inhibition of signals coming up. And that is also how lots of the centrally acting medications work. And so actually, it may be that there is an overlap between the mechanisms that are used by the drug and the placebo, or they may be working in completely different ways. And without having a mechanistic component within that, it's quite hard to understand exactly how much additional benefit your drug might have had over and above placebo.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
All right, so as the final speaker for the session, I would like to ask Lucy Whittaker to come up here. Lucy is a clinical lecturer in obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Edinburgh. She's part of the expect team there. In 2018, she became a WES Early Career Ambassador, and she, I think since 2019, sits as an Early Career Ambassador on the board of WES as well. Lucy's going to tell us about the role of genetic discovery in clinical trials. Lucy.
Thank you very much, Christian, and thank you very much for the organising committee for the invitation. It's been wonderful to come to Istanbul. Thank you for your hospitality. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of genetic discovery in clinical trials, which is very much the sort of area with the research that I'm positioned as a clinician trialist, and so my disclosures really reflect clinician trials. But what I'm going to cover today is to start thinking about why we should embed genetic clinical trials, and particularly how pharmacogenomics can help guide us in precision care, particularly in terms of unlocking target populations to try and identify who will respond to which medication, but also about minimizing side effects. But first of all, we heard quite a lot yesterday about how genetic studies can give us real insights into the disease, as well as potential variants for new treatment targets. And I think it's particularly within clinical trials, we've got very well characterized participants. So we know within these much larger genetic studies, phenotyping of patients is really important to be able to draw robust conclusions. And so I think particularly when data is collected within these trials and you use strategies such as worth effect to have collected that information in a standardized fashion, can allow real opportunity for collaboration in the future. But what I really want to focus on today is about precision treatment. And so I just want to take a moment to think of us all to consider about where we are currently in terms of treatment paradigms and the current therapeutic space, which at present predominantly relates to application of surgery and predominantly hormonal treatments. And whilst we do try and individualize care, by and large, we have relatively standard algorithms, which we make generalized recommendations to most of our patients, notwithstanding whether or not pain or infertility is their primary concern. But we need to do better than this. I think particularly what it is about learning to subdivide our populations to try and identify which populations are going to respond better to which treatment. But one of our additional challenges is that we recognise that their needs are going to change across their reproductive life course. So something that might be an appropriate treatment for someone who's not seeking fertility at a younger age might not be as appropriate as someone later on in their life. And I think where we're all very conscious of is that we are very behind areas such as oncology. And I think we can look to some of the strategies that they've utilised to try and exploit this within endometriosis. So if we consider breast cancer, and Karina brought this up yesterday, so the mainstay of breast cancer treatment initially was very much surgical, but that has now become much less radical. And the most important treatments now are really the medical treatments, be it hormonal treatments, chemotherapy, and now that move to immunotherapy. And what's really unlocked this is better understanding of the disease, the molecular type of disease, understanding some of the genetics, such as identification of the HER2 gene and BRCA1 and 2 mutations. And it's these understanding disease that's led to this improvement in treatment outcomes. So breast cancer survival has doubled over the last 30 years, and that's predominantly been driven by the change in medical treatment, which has been driven by these better understanding of the genetic variation within the disease and giving us new treatment targets. Now, we're getting better at this in endometriosis. We do still understand that hormonal component is extremely important. Doug Gibson talked about that very eloquently yesterday. But I think also now, reframing it as a neuroinflammatory condition actually allows us to have a whole load heap new treatment targets, as well as repurposing drugs from spheres such as inflammatory disease and cancer. So that sort of teaching an old drug a new trick. And I think genetics also plays a part in this identifying new targets. But even if we have new treatments, we've got to work out who to apply them to. And when we consider at present our precision treatment, well, we certainly consider, I think, particularly from a surgical perspective, about what the subtype of the disease is and what recommendations should be relative to superficial disease, perhaps compared to a deep phenotype. We also can consider based on what their primary symptoms are when they're presenting, but how can we use genetics to further refine this? Now, I think a lot of the genetic signal of the disease, we're still really unpicking this. And so I think we're some way away from having a single genetic signal from the disease itself that can give us a treatment approach. So I think more easily accessible, and what we can learn from clinical trials, is how using an individual's genetic makeup can help guide treatment. And that's really what this area of pharmacogenomics is out. So it's using genomic technologies to optimize both drug dose and also choice in individual features, both to maximize efficiency, but also minimize toxicity, as well as also it's got real potential for discovery and development of novel drugs. Now, there is a huge element of unknowns about this in endometriosis, and that's one of the why embedding genomic testing within clinical trials can allow us to start understanding where we can apply this in our patients. So, first of all, I want to talk about using genomics to predict efficacy, and I think one of the areas that we've found this in Edinburgh is the insights we got from the GAP2 trial, which Andrew's already described.